Imagine you go out into the street with a microphone and ask people, what do you know about war in the 20th century? In 9 cases out of 10, you'll hear the same things. Hitler, Stalin, fascism, concentration camps, the Holocaust, tanks near Moscow, Stalingrad, the Normandy landings, Hiroshima. People will remember the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, movies, games, memes, school lessons, and now the same question, but with a clarification. And what do you know about the First World War? And suddenly, a pause. Someone will say, well, Franz Ferdinand, trenches, gas, dugouts. Someone might remember the names Somme or Verdun, but without details. Someone will just say, that was a long time ago. Before the second, I don't really know much. And in this silence lies the whole paradox of the 20th century. The First World War turned the world map upside down, killed millions of people, destroyed 4 empires, and essentially prepared the ground for Hitler's rise to power, for the Second World War, for revolutions and totalitarian regimes. But in mass consciousness, it seems to live in the shadows. People talk about it, it is studied, but nowhere near as loudly, as emotionally, or as thoroughly as the second. Why did it turn out this way? Why has the war that was once called the Great War given way today to another, later catastrophe? Why do films, games, books, memes, school lessons, family stories return so actively to 1939, 1945, and much more rarely to 1914, 1918? Let's figure it out. Let's start with a very simple but harsh point. The scale of destruction. The First World War was monstrous. Millions killed, tens of millions wounded and maimed. A huge number of people who came back from the front physically alive but broken inside. The fronts stretched from Western Europe to the Middle East, from the Balkans to Africa. For its time, it was an absolutely unprecedented meat grinder in terms of scale. But then came the Second World War, and in terms of casualties, it literally covered everything that came before. Humanity saw the total destruction of entire cities, mass genocide, factories of death, blockades, famine, carpet bombing. If the First World War was terrifying and inhuman, the second became the symbol of absolute systemic industrial horror. And mass consciousness is not a statistician or a historian. It thinks in images. For people of the 20th century, the trauma of the Second World War turned out to be deeper. Far more civilians died in it, not just soldiers. In the trenches of the First, mainly conscripted men died. In the Second World War, everyone died. Children under bombs, old people in blockaded cities, entire peoples, entire villages and neighborhoods wiped off the map. Imagine an ordinary family. In one reality, a grandfather died in France in 1916, somewhere near Verdun. All that's left of him is an old photograph, 2 or 3 stories, a couple of lines in. Family law. In another reality, there's a family where one relative died at Stalingrad, another went missing near Leningrad, a third died in a concentration camp, and the great-grandmother survived a bombing and told her children and grandchildren about it. Where is the trauma stronger? Where does memory cling more tightly to everyday life, to emotions, to conversations? The Second World War entered every kitchen, every school textbook, every national mythology. It became a drama not only of the front, but of the home front as well, a drama of millions of ordinary civilians. The first, despite all its bloodshed, is perceived primarily as a war of soldiers, armies, empires. But it's not just about numbers and not just about how many people died. There is another crucial point: moral and ideological clarity. In mass consciousness, the Second World War is a very understandable story. There is an obvious evil, Nazism. There is a charismatic anti-hero, Hitler, a face, a symbol, a concentrated embodiment of all the nightmare that unfolded in Europe. There are concentration camps, there is the Holocaust, there is the genocide of Jews and other groups, there is an ideology that openly says some people are above others, some deserve to live, others do not. On the other side, there is the anti-Hitler coalition, resistance movements, partisans, soldiers who liberate camps, raise flags over Berlin, break into Auschwitz, reach the Reichstag. This is a story where it's easy to assign roles. Here's the villain, here's the victim, here's the hero. Now let's try to do the same with the First World War. Who is the villain there? Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Britain and France defending their colonies, or maybe everyone at once? The First World War is a war of empires, alliances, dynasties, treaties, secret agreements, long-standing competition for markets and colonies. It's a conflict where there is no sharply defined, demonized evil like Nazism. There are a lot of ambitions, a lot of mistakes, a lot of arrogance from politicians. Some monarchs and governments drag their peoples into war, others can't stop. Chains of alliances trigger a chain reaction of mobilizations, ultimatums, declarations of war. For an ordinary person, this story is much less dramatic in a moral sense. It looks like a gigantic, monstrous, but still political mistake made by a lot of leaders. There is no single clear point where you can say, here is the main monster, here is the source of evil. This one is to blame for everything. That's why it's harder to talk about this war and harder to show it in stark black and white moral tones. And mass culture loves simple, bright, high-contrast plots. The Second World War gives it exactly that. The first does not. A third important point is the visual and emotional selling power. When we think of the Second World War, images immediately pop into our heads. Newsreel footage, tanks, bombings, city assaults, ruined houses, the flag over the Reichstag, footage from liberated camps. These scenes were shown on television for decades, included in movies, documentaries, educational videos, news segments. The First World War also left behind footage, but it's mostly black and white, more static. Soldiers trudging through mud, artillery flashes, long trenches, rows of wounded, columns of prisoners of war. Visually, it seems more slow, more monotonous. Most of the horror of that war is not in the dynamic action, but in the daily, drawn-out, endless life in trenches, in mud, with lice, with fear. It's hard to show that as a spectacular film that will work well for a wide audience. It's no coincidence that the most famous work about the First World War is not some blockbuster about a heroic assault, but Erich Maria Remarque's novel All Quiet on the Western Front and its film adaptations. There is no victory there, no triumph, no clear meaning. There is prolonged torment, senseless assaults, the deaths of friends, lives falling apart. It's terrifying, but it's not the kind of spectacle that the mass viewer of war movies is used to. The fourth point is historical overlay and the shadow of subsequent events. In many countries, the events that followed immediately after the First World War literally covered it in people's memory. Take Russia, for example. For Russian and then Soviet historiography, for a long time, the First World War was not great, but imperialist. Already during the war, the 1917 revolution begins, then the Civil War, the Red and White Terrors, famine, repression. The scale of internal upheaval is so huge that the First World War is perceived as a prologue, as the old regime, as a backdrop to the main story, the revolution and the building of new power. Later, in the Soviet era, the central place in national memory was taken by the Great Patriotic War. There was a clear enemy, fascist Germany. There was a struggle for the country's survival. There was a gigantic sacrifice by the people. There was heroism and victory. This became the core of Soviet identity, the myth around which all patriotic rhetoric was built. Against this background, the First World War looked like something alien, a war of Tsarism, a war for other people's interests, a war in which the people died for the bourgeoisie and the monarchy. In Germany, the First World War also ended up in a strange position. On the one hand, there was the defeat of 1918, the Treaty of Versailles, humiliation, economic crisis, hyperinflation. All of that was a very painful trauma. On the other hand, compared to the catastrophe of the Second World War, the destruction of cities, the division of the country, the crimes of Nazism, the Holocaust, it was the Second World War that became the main subject of rethinking, guilt, and public discussion. The first conflict gradually receded into the background. It became a kind of psychological prehistory of Hitler's rise, rather than the main object of moral analysis. In France and Britain, the memory of the First World War is stronger than, say, in Russia. There are war cemeteries, monuments to the fallen, local memorials in every town, school trips to battlefields. But even there, in mass culture, in the film industry, in international discourse, the Second World War sounds louder. It is associated with resistance, occupation, liberation, Allies, Normandy, Churchill, Dunkirk. It turns out that in different countries, the First World War either overlaps with revolutions and internal upheavals, or ends up as a prologue to the Second, or is overshadowed by an even more powerful trauma. In a moral sense, the First World War doesn't give people a feeling of closure. The Second, for all its horrors, ends in mass consciousness with the victory over evil. Nazism is defeated, the camps are liberated, the main criminals are tried at Nuremberg. Yes, the world after 1945 didn't become perfect. The Cold War began, new conflicts appeared, but the Nazi project itself was destroyed, and that is perceived as a moral victory for humanity. But what about the First World War? It doesn't end with a sense of justice, but with a feeling of something unfinished and unfair. Germany and its allies sign harsh peace terms. Millions of Germans feel humiliated, deceived, robbed. In Germany itself, myths begin to spread about a stab in the back, that the army supposedly could have kept fighting, but the politicians betrayed it. In Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, collapse, chaos, revolutions, civil wars. Instead of leading to a stable peace, the First World War creates an explosive structure. Borders are redrawn in such a way that old contradictions don't disappear and sometimes even grow stronger. On the ruins of empires, new states are born, where several different peoples with different interests and different historical memories live side by side. In the Middle East, borders are drawn with a ruler on the map, ignoring a complex ethnic and religious mosaic, and just 2 decades later, this peace explodes again, this time even more terribly. Many historians today talk about the period from 1914 to 1945 as one long drawn-out war with pauses. The First World War, then the interwar crisis, then the Second World War. But mass consciousness doesn't work that way. People are used to dividing history into titles, like films, Part 1, Part 2. And in that logic, the second part ends up being brighter, louder, and more dramatic than the first. Another factor is how the participants of the war themselves spoke about it, or stayed silent. Veterans of the First World War often came home with the feeling that it had all been in vain. Of course, there had been heroic episodes, feats of courage, endurance, mutual help, friendship. But if you asked, what was it all for? Many couldn't find an answer. They saw that the world they had supposedly fought for was quickly collapsing. Revolution in Russia, fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, economic crisis, unemployment, radical ideologies. All this created a sense of incredible cosmic meaninglessness. Out of this wound grew an entire direction in literature and art. The lost generation, dystopias, pessimism, cynicism. It was much easier to fit the soldier of the Second World War, especially in the victorious countries, into a national myth. We fought against absolute evil, we saved the world, we won. Veterans of the First World War often didn't have such a clear narrative, and when you have nothing to tell as a story of meaning, you're more likely to avoid going back to it at all. A separate topic is how school programs and mass education are set up. In most countries, when it comes to the 20th century, textbooks physically cannot explain everything in detail. They need to talk about industrialization, colonialism, the First World War, revolutions. the interwar period, the Second World War, the Cold War, the collapse of colonial empires, globalization. As a result, teachers and textbook authors are forced to choose what to focus on more. And most often, that focus goes to the Second World War because it's closer in time. It's directly connected to the political map we live on today. It's tied to conflicts and ideologies that are still being discussed. It gives more convenient material for moral lessons about the price of racism, the price of totalitarianism, the inadmissibility of genocide. The First World War, meanwhile, remains in the textbook as a kind of big prelude. They talk about the assassination in Sarajevo, about the alliance system, about the trenches, about gas, about Versailles, and then quickly move on to the crisis of the 1930s and Hitler's rise to power. So even inside the school narrative, it is initially presented as a step towards the second, not as a gigantic tragedy in its own right. And here we come to another important detail: responsibility and guilt. The Second World War is a war in which there are very clearly recognized crimes: the Holocaust, the destruction of civilians, mass murder based on nationality. There is a specific state and ideology that are found guilty. There is a tribunal. There is international condemnation. With the First World War, everything is more complicated. Whom do we consider the main culprit? Germany and Austria-Hungary bear the main responsibility? But didn't Britain and France participate in a hidden arms race and act out of colonial interests? Didn't the Russian Empire pursue its own expansionist policy? Weren't the Balkan conflicts heating up tensions for years? It turns out that assigning blame here is uncomfortable. There is no handy monster image, and that means collective memory forms more sluggishly. It's easier to say it was a tragic mistake of the elites, a chain reaction of bad decisions that no one managed to stop in time. That's true, but it doesn't give you a vivid image for a poster and doesn't turn into a convenient storyline for mass cinema. Speaking of cinema, Hollywood, European cinema, the Soviet industry, all of them invested enormous resources specifically in depicting the Second World War. Films about the Normandy landings, about partisans, spies, concentration camps, resistance, the front, dozens, hundreds of movies, series, documentaries. There are far fewer films about the First World War, and many of them are heavy, depressing, without a heroic halo. They can be artistically powerful, but the mass audience often wants not only suffering, but also catharsis, victory, some kind of narrative resolution. In films about the Second World War, that catharsis is much more common. As a result, the entire cultural layer on which our ideas about the past grow works to strengthen the memory of the Second World War and to gradually fade out the First. But none of this means that the First World War was less important or secondary. Quite the opposite, precisely because people talk about it less. Many don't realize how deeply it penetrated the structure of the 20th century. If there had been no First World War, there would have been no Treaty of Versailles with its humiliation of Germany and heavy reparations. There wouldn't have been such a powerful desire for revenge, such fertile soil for Nazism. There wouldn't have been the collapse of four empires at once: the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman. There wouldn't have been such a rapid emergence of new, often unstable states in Eastern and Central Europe, in the Balkans, in the Middle East. Millions of people who returned from the front brought back into peacetime a new experience. The experience of mass violence, of human life being devalued, of being used to weapons, of radicalization. Many future dictators and radical leaders were veterans of the First World War. They had been through its trenches, seen the worthlessness of the old elites, and decided to build a new world by any means necessary. So when we say people remember the Second World War more than the First, it doesn't mean the First is less important. It means that its consequences are more hidden, less obvious, more stretched out over time. The Second is like an explosion, loud, blinding. The first is like a slow but powerful shift of a tectonic plate, after which entire continents of political order start to crumble. Why then should we talk about the First World War more often? First, because it teaches us to beware of the overconfidence of elites. The war didn't start because people dreamed of mutual destruction, but because politicians and generals thought a short victorious conflict will mobilize, strike, everyone will be scared and sit down at the negotiating table. No one expected 4 years of trenches, gas, tanks and artillery slaughter. Almost everyone told their nations, "We'll be home by Christmas." Second, the First World War shows how dangerous rigid blocs are when countries are tied together by alliances so tightly that a local conflict automatically drags the whole world in. The assassination of the heir to the throne in Sarajevo was a regional incident that under normal circumstances might have ended with pressure, negotiations, a local war. But in a world where everyone is locked into a chain of alliances and mobilization plans, it became the detonator of a global catastrophe. Third, the memory of the First World War reminds us that wars may be not only battles of light and dark forces, but also the result of a combination of mistakes, ambition, mistrust, egoism, and fear. That's an uncomfortable truth because it doesn't let us keep the illusion that evil is always obvious and easily recognizable. But it's an important truth because situations like that are the easiest to repeat. And finally, talking about the First World War gives a voice to those who were silenced for a very long time. The soldiers rotting in trenches under the rain, the colonial troops dying for someone else's empires, civilians who were never asked if they wanted war, a young generation that, instead of university and careers, got gas attacks and shrapnel. We talk about the Second World War, and that's right. But if we forget the first, it's as if we tear out half of the tragic sentence of the 20th century. We see only the climax, but not the setup. So next time you hear the phrase First World War, try not to wave it off as something old and irrelevant. Try to imagine not only grey newsreels and strange helmets, but whole lives, whole peoples, a whole era that thought it was living in the most civilized, progressive, cultured Europe, and in just a few years turned that Europe into a field of trenches. And maybe realizing how fragile that civilized world turned out to be back then will help us look a little more carefully at our own. The First World War is not just the war before the Second. It's the moment when humanity first realized that it could destroy itself industrially, methodically, on a massive scale. The Second just pushed that ability to the limit. People talk more about the Second World War, but you can't fully understand the 20th century, the roots of many of today's conflicts, or why the world looks the way it does now, without going back again and again to those years when millions of people went to the front, convinced they were defending their homeland, their ideals, their civilization, and very often died without ever finding out what exactly they had died for. And maybe one of the ways to change this situation is exactly what we're doing right now, telling, explaining, asking questions, pulling out of the shadows that war, which once seemed great and then was almost forgotten.